Hello and welcome to the Holistically Psyched podcast. I'm your host, Mariah Choate, a nationally certified school psychologist turned stay-at-home mom who now has the freedom to share what school districts don't want you to know after spending over a decade in the field of education. My goal is to help you learn all you need to know about special education that districts often gatekeep. Each episode will dive into how commonly laws are blatantly broken and tips on leveraging special education law to support best practice for students and teachers alike. We'll also feature interviews with parents and educators who are navigating these challenges head-on, along with those who are making strides to improve this broken system. This channel is for you, parents of students with suspected or diagnosed disabilities who already have or might need individualized education plans or 504 plans. It's also for teachers, counselors, and fellow school psychologists who are feeling the strain of a system that often leaves us feeling burnt out and overwhelmed. So if you're ready to learn, advocate, and empower yourself, child, or students, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to the Holistically Psyched podcast. I'm your host, Mariah Choate, and today we have a great guest who will share her expertise as a school psychologist at the high school level, and specifically how to empower students with knowledge about their IEPs. Before we start, let me remind you that our mission here is to share all about the behind the scenes of special education from individuals committed to making change. We're here to empower parents and educators with the knowledge and skills to help them advocate for their children or students. So let's welcome our guest today, all the way from Northern California, Briana from Educationally Psyched. Briana, thank you so much for being here with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became involved in supporting students with disabilities in the education system?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be on your podcast. So, as you said, I'm a school psychologist. I'm very newly a high school psychologist. I started working in the high school last year, but I have been a school psychologist now. This is my 9th year, if you include my internship. I'm losing track now, but before that, I was a teacher. And so I'd say that that's where my passion first started, is when I was a kindergarten teacher. And as anyone that knows who has taught kindergarten or any early elementary, that's sometimes kids' first experience with school. And so I had a student of mine that I had a strong suspicion they were autistic, and the parents hadn't, explored any of the options with that. And I just really felt like I needed to connect them to more support. And so I talked to my principal, and they were the one that told me that I needed to talk to the school psychologist. And I had no idea what a school psychologist even was. I think that's very common for people that even like when you hear stories of people that are school psychologists now, they're like, I never even knew about this job. So I had no idea a school psychologist even existed until I worked with one on this case. And we got my student support, and it was such a cool process that I was like, I want to do this. This is the career I want. And so that's where that journey began.
So cool. I love hearing about that. And it's so nice that you have the perspective of not just a school psychologist, but you also have the perspective of a teacher, seeing the other side of it. And it's so interesting that even as an educator, you don't necessarily know all the roles going on in the school behind the scenes, unless, like you said, you need it and you needed to advocate for your student to get help. So I just love how you bring an aspect, not just from the teaching side, but also the psychologist side. And I also love how your page is very informative. I've learned so much just from following you. And I think that you handle a lot of the nuances of things that could be controversial very, very well, because you seem to be open to a lot of education. That's what it's all about, right? We're always learning, we're always growing. So, in your experience, can you speak to how common it is that students are confused or don't know about why they might have an IEP? And can you also walk us through what the process might look like when you help inform them?
Yeah, so this has actually been, since I moved to high school, one of my biggest areas of passion is making sure that there's developmentally or age appropriate transparency around special education, around disabilities. And I came to start having that passion if in a very frustrating way, actually, because I would have students come to my office for their evaluation, and they would have really no idea what an IEP was, what a disability was. Sometimes that even they had special education services, and these are high schoolers. So I could kind of see how there's kind of a back and forth with parents. A lot of time I'm used to elementary school where they're like, I don't know how much I should tell them, if I should tell them, and they want support around that. And a lot of that fear comes from, are they too young? Is this going to be confusing for them? Is this going to be something that's going to make them feel bad about themselves, or they're going to use it as an excuse or something like that? There's a lot of that for them. But I would think that by high school, these kids are getting ready to graduate and potentially start working or go to college. And we really want people to be able to understand themselves and advocate for their needs. And so it just really didn't sit right with me that here I was working with high schoolers that were, in the next few years going to graduate and be these kind of adults. And they had no idea. And some of them had had IEPs for like a decade at that point. So I just thought that was like so absurd. Actually, and I'm allowed to share this. I actually talked to my husband about this because I'm like, I don't want to tell your story for you. And he said it was okay. But my husband was actually, he went through some psychoeducational testing when he was in high school. And he just had such a negative experience with it because he felt like, something was wrong with him. His teachers thought something was wrong with him. His parents thought something was wrong with him. And then he would go to see the psychologist. They do a bunch of tests, and then he didn't really ever know what became of it. It's actually interesting him being married to me, and he's like, oh, you're one of those people. And I'm like, I'm a good person. I would never want to hurt kids. So like, how can you, think badly about my profession, but love me and think I'm doing a good job? So we talked about it, and I was like, would it have helped if someone explained to you why are you even being tested?
Mhm.
What the results of your testing is, like what you can do with that information. He's like, I think that would have made a big difference.
Yeah.
So I always keep my husband in mind whenever I meet with a student. I'm like, okay, they deserve to know at the very least, like why I'm pulling them out of class. And I feel like that's like, now that I've been doing it this way for a few years now, I'm like, I don't know how I could have ever done it the other way. Just like, hi, I'm the school psychologist. Let's sit down and do this work. Okay, bye. See you later. It feels wrong. So
Mhm.
now I always I start off my session saying, like, do you know why you're meeting with me? And some of them will have some idea, like, oh, I'm supposed to be doing testing. And then I kind of just gather like their background knowledge of it. Like, what do they already know? And I'll ask them specifically, do you know what an IEP is? Or do you know you have an IEP? And a few more of them will say like, oh, yeah, I think I know what that is. Or, oh, that's how the teachers are supposed to follow certain things to give me help. And they'll have like a general idea of what it is. And then I'll say like, do you know what specifically your IEP is for, or what it's supposed to help you with? And even fewer know how to answer that question. So I kind of start with that, and I give them a little background. We even look through the document together. We talk about their disability, um, you know, and then when I tell them about the testing, I explain to them if it's an initial that we're looking to see if they need that support in school or if they have a disability. And if it's like, one of the triennials where we're reevaluating to see if they still need it. And then I get them involved in the process. Like, well, what do you think? Do you think you need services like this? Is what you have so far helping you? Is there anything you think should be different about it? Is there anything else going on that you feel like you're not getting support with right now? So it really becomes a completely different environment for them where it's not just me as this professional using them for information to write in a report and share with their parents. Now it's a more empowering process where we're working together. They're actively involved in the whole thing, and they're going to get something out of it because they know I care about like what's going on with them at school, and we're working together to make the best plan that we can make.
I love that because then you're giving them kind of that ownership to
Hmm.
actually do something with the information that comes from it instead of just like being a science experiment. Where
Yeah.
I can actually use this information to figure out what my strengths are, right? And align my interests with my strengths because I know that I'm good in that area.
Yeah, and I like how you said science experiment because when my husband described his whole situation when he was tested, it did feel like he thought that he was being experimented on. And I'm sure, you know, if he had gotten more context, he wouldn't have made that whole thing up in his head. But that's really how he remembers it, basically, that they were just like trying to figure out what was wrong with his brain, is kind
Yeah.
of how he describes it.
Oh my gosh, that hurts my heart a little bit.
Me too.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that because from my perspective, I did like ECE and elementary and middle school, and so looking at especially my elementary years, parents were coming to us with just like so much frustration, and they'd been pushed around, as you know, with my page, right? Like they've been given pushback from the school for a long time. So by the time I was initially, attesting the child, they were very aware of like, I can't read, I can't do this, I'm struggling with this, or I don't know what my teacher's talking about. Like they're just so frustrated. And they would even tell me, like my mom said I had autism. My mom said I had ADHD. It was
Mm,
almost like this, I'm the one that they're coming to for help because they're like, oh no, I know you're going to help me. So let me figure out these tests, which was so interesting for elementary school because you would
yeah.
assume that there wouldn't be that much transparency. But again, it was a population where parents were fed up and they'd been through this process so much that they're like, okay,
Mm.
we need to figure out what's going on with you. So I'm curious. I understand that that's how you work with a student, but do you ever get pushback from parents of like, I don't want that to be that transparent or anything like that?
Yeah, so I get that question all the time when I start talking about being transparent with students, especially from elementary school psychologists. When I was in elementary school, obviously this has been more of a passion for me since I've been in high school, like I said, but even in some level, I was doing it in elementary school, just talking about like why are we testing and what are your goals and things like that. With elementary school, I definitely think that it would be the right thing to do to talk to the parent first and say, you know, do you feel comfortable having this conversation with your child yourself? Do you want any resources or support in having this conversation? Do you want me to have the conversation and then have you follow up with them afterwards? More of a conversation around like what they would feel comfortable with, because I do understand that different parents have different ways of talking to their kids, and I would never want to overstep. And if they, and I did have some parents tell me, you know, like I'd prefer not to use the word autism, or I'd prefer not to, you know, say this in this specific way. Um, and it's not my job, it's not my place to judge them for that and say, you know, that's wrong. I have my own opinions, but that's irrelevant. You know, that's their child. It's their parenting journey. I will say that I am pretty adamant in elementary school. I was pretty adamant at least letting them know that they had a plan and they had services. And so when I would pull them for counseling, I wanted them to be able to know this is part of your plan. You meet with me this many times a week. We work on this.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think at the very least, like the child needs to know that, because if
Mm-hmm.
you're being pulled out of class and you're meeting with someone that not everybody else meets with, kindergarteners know that there's something up, you know. They're not oblivious to the world. They know that they're getting something that other kids don't get, and it's either going to come from a loving, caring adult, why that is, or it's going to come from their peers who may not understand, or it may come from themselves and they'll say, I get this because I'm a bad kid, I get this because I'm not smart. And
Mm-hmm.
we don't want them to have, you know, that perspective on it, and we should really be working with them to give them a better vocabulary around why they're getting those services. So it doesn't necessarily have to be you have this disability or whatever, but it does need to be transparent enough of like, in my opinion, of this is a plan and these
Yeah.
are the people that meet with you that help you with this. But in high school kids come to their IEPs. So, I mean, if you're in your IEP meeting, like, to me, that feels like all of this is stuff you should know. And eventually you turn 18 and the educational rights go to you. So I would feel like it was very irresponsible to not share all this information with the student who is now, you know, going to be in charge of their own education.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really get any pushback at all at the high school level on that. If anything, parents are like, "Can you have the conversation for me?" Or, you know, or they've already told their kid at that point.
I think back on so many parents. I'm talking so many parents that when I mention Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, they're like, disability? Like
Uh-huh.
there's so many teams and I think such a negative view on certain words like autism or ADHD or an IEP, right? Special education, there's so much negativity, I think, surrounding those specific words that we can almost do a disservice as an IEP team to like kind of skirt past certain words and not fully explain out what is special education, what's the design of special education, right? Yeah, so it's interesting that you share that perspective. And I love that you're bringing your students into that process. And it's not like you're hijacking, like you said, you're not hijacking like the parents' role, but you're bringing them all together to work as a team. Okay, so why do you think it's so important for students to fully understand their IEPs and take an active role in that process?
They're going to be in charge, and they're the only person on the IEP team. We'll start with that. A student is the only person on the IEP team that this plan is going to impact for the rest of their life. Not their teacher, not their school psychologist, not their principal, not even their parents. So they are the most important member of that team. And I just think that it's just unfair. I think it's unjust for them to not fully understand it because it's their brain, their learning, their needs, their strengths. And the plan is for them. Everything is for them. So if you come at it from that perspective, it's kind of wild to think that, they wouldn't know about it. Like, I think also, one of the other things that I've heard from people is that they're like, this whole room of adults are talking all about me and what I need and what's challenging for me and like where's my voice in that. It's
Mhm.
kind of uncomfortable too that it's like all of these people are having conversations and making decisions about your life and where's your voice in that?
Yeah.
So I think it's so important. And then you have all of these people. I've actually, you know, seen a lot of this online too of people that have either like their diagnosis was kept from them or they were very late diagnosed and they're just like I wish I would have understood this about myself earlier. That would have changed so much for me if I would have known this about myself. I used to think that having the actual like label or diagnosis wasn't that important, but after listening to enough people talk about it, it's like, you know what? No. A lot of people do find that very important because it's a way for them to connect themselves to resources and communities. And
Hmm.
so being aware of everything in your IEP, what your needs are, what your diagnosis is, can really help you better understand yourself and advocate for yourself in life. I think that it's like an essential part of it too. And also, the more that we as adults normalize it, the less it becomes this thing of shame,
Yeah.
Like, oh, we got to be quiet about the fact that you have a disability because well, that makes it sound like it's a bad thing. And it's like, no, this is just something that you are going to deal with your whole life. And there's some good that can come out of it. There's some challenges that can come out of it. And here are the things that can be offered for support. And here's how you can advocate for yourself if you're not getting the support you need.
Right. So, speaking of students having a voice for themselves, in IEP meetings specifically, are there any tips or any strategies that you could recommend for students being able to have that voice in the meeting?
I think that the students should be encouraged to ask questions. And I think this is more of a tip for the team. But when you're presenting, I always try to present to the student. I think it's very common for people to slip into saying, like, oh, he performed this and he's good at this and this is a challenge for him. And the student is sitting right there. And to me, that's just like, it's so awkward because they're in the room with you. As much as I can, obviously, I'm still including the parent and everybody else on the IEP team in the conversation. But when it comes to actually sharing the results, I'll look straight at the student and say, you scored in this range and that means this, and talking directly to them because, again, it's their brain, it's their skills, it's their strengths, it's their areas of need. So, I mean, it applies to them more than anybody else. So they're the ones that should be talked to. So in terms of like the actual student in the meeting, I would encourage them to ask questions if they don't understand, because a lot of times people can have a conversation at a level that might be using vocabulary or jargon that the student won't understand. And I think that it might be very intimidating, though, for the student to say, what did that mean? Can you explain that to me more? So I know that's like a hard tip to give directly to a student, because that's a very intimidating situation. So I guess, again, that's more of a tip for the rest of the team.
Mm.
Be conscious of the level of language you're speaking in and how much jargon you're using, and encourage the student to ask questions if they don't understand, and say, does that make sense to you? Or give like more concrete examples, instead of just saying like, oh, your listening comprehension is low. You can say like, when someone gives you directions, it's harder for you to follow the steps, just using as concrete of examples as possible, so that it can apply in a way that everybody, I mean, anybody on the team would benefit from that, knowing more concrete examples.
I was just thinking that, and like not just the student, but everyone on the team would benefit from that. Because even educators that have been teaching a long time, right? Like you're hearing a lot of jargon sometimes, and you're like, I don't even know what that would look like in the classroom. But hearing a concrete example would be like, oh, it's connecting for them too, right? And it's connecting for the student and especially the parent. I know as you're saying this, I'm like, I know so many parents that would feel so uncomfortable speaking up or saying like, I don't know what that means, or I'm confused about that, or could you give me an example, right? So I love that idea of making sure you're checking in. My professor said this a long time ago, my favorite professor, but she was like, if you're not speaking at an 8th grade level in communicating, like you're saying, concrete examples, explaining special education law, explaining eligibility, if you're not like speaking at an 8th grade level, you should try to as much as possible, because that means that you're able to explain it well.
Yeah, and just a funny aside, I guess, it's like, I think as I've gotten deeper into my career, I care about this a lot less. But I remember in the beginning of my career, especially because I come off looking younger, maybe sometimes too, not as much anymore. But you want to talk in like more academic, fancy language, because you want to prove to the other people on the team that you know what you're talking about, that you're a professional, that you're an authority. And so I know I'm so guilty of that, especially in my first couple years. It's like, I want to sound smart. Now looking back on it, it's like, yeah, there's a little ego in that, because it's just like, it was about me, but the meetings are not about me.
Right.
I have information that I'm there to share, but it's about the student. And so does it matter? Obviously, I have the certification. I'm in the role, so that should be enough to say like I can do my job. I don't need to prove myself any farther than that. And the best way to prove yourself is by having a meeting where everybody gets something out of it and feels like they understood things that you said. So
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't matter how smart you sound. If nobody understands you, you didn't do an effective job.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Oh, I love this one. Can you share some examples of how focusing on students' strengths rather than areas of challenge can help students succeed academically and personally?
I love this one too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I especially love it now in high school that always the students are in our meetings, because I do think it helps you shift your mind to like, okay, I need to say this in a way that's empowering, because when there's a face right there and you're talking about all of the things that they can't do or that are hard for them, it doesn't, at least for me, I hope this is this way for other people too, but it doesn't feel good when you're just dwelling on all of the things that are challenging. So having their face in front of me and talking directly to them is definitely an extra push to be like, okay, how do I make this like, and it's not to gloss over things that are challenged. It definitely don't leave out things that need to be said. The student also knows that things are challenging, right? They're not oblivious to that. So still say things that are challenging, but by bringing in their strengths, by bringing in what we can do to help them, really changes the atmosphere of the meeting too. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not like you're leaving just thinking like, wow, I feel really bad about myself, or I really feel bad about my kid. They can't do all these things that they're supposed to be doing at their age. Like, that makes everybody feel awful.
Yeah.
But instead, if you're like, okay, here's an area that is more of a challenge for you compared to other kids your age. And here is the exact thing that we have in your IEP, the goal, the service, all of that, that is intended to support you in that.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're having a challenge with this, this is what service you have. This is what accommodation you have. This is the service provider that's going to be supporting you in doing that. So the whole plan is supposed to be about that, right? It's not necessarily about like what you can't do. It's like, what are we going to do to help you? How are
Right.
we going to support you? So if you think about it that way, it actually can be a super supportive, empowering, positive meeting because
Yeah.
you're having a meeting all about what we can do to help.
I'm thinking right now of certain meetings I've been in where it's almost the parent that's like, no, I need to explain and try to win you over on how much my kid needs help. So let me say all these negative things, or even teachers that like, oh, I need to tell you all the negative things because they really need this IEP, right? Especially
Mm,
initial IEPs. And it's so funny because, yeah, you're totally right. Like bringing in their strengths actually is the biggest piece because you're saying, this is exactly where you can thrive and where you have been shown to thrive. And even in these weaker areas, we have support for that. And you have strength. So you just have extra help and you have extra support in those areas. This is an aside, but it takes a lot more work as an IEP team to sit to listen and say, these are the concerns and I need to be creative with the team to meet that need as best I can. And it might not look the same as 3 years ago, right? It
mm,
takes a lot of work and diligence, I think, as a team and a lot of collaboration. And so it could be that that's why that might not happen all the time. Is like, it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of know-how with the student. And when you have a giant caseload, or if you're a teacher and you're doing so many IEPs throughout the week, it's easy to lose track and just be
mm,
like, oh, I just need to sell it on like this kid needs help, or a parent like frustrated, like, no, I need to sell it on my kid needs help really bad and they need this IEP. Like, well, let's bring it back to what can we do about that, right? What can
mm-hmm.
we do about the support that we have? So, what resources or tools would you recommend for students and families to become more empowered in managing their IEPs and also understanding their rights?
So personally, I've found the social media so incredibly helpful for even as a practitioner to connect with other professionals in special education, advocates, lawyers. I just find out so much stuff online, and I think it's just a wonderful way to connect yourself to the community of people that do this for a living that and even people that are advocate and for themselves and teaching about their disability that are not in special education, just learning what works for them and how to navigate life with that disability. So I on my Instagram, it's educationally psyched, and that's because I am a psychologist, but I'm also psyched about education. So I created a community on Instagram where it's supposed to be parents and educators alike being able to learn together about special education, school psychology, and all about how to support diverse needs of students within a school. Um, I really enjoy the community I've created there because I do feel like we get the school perspective, we get the parent perspective, we get the lived experience perspective whenever we have conversations. And so if you don't follow me, I recommend it. I hope there'd be stuff for you there. We talk about all sorts of things, anything that comes up because I still work in the schools. So there's always things that like come up in my brain and I'm like, you know what? I want to talk to everybody about this. And so we'll have discussions and then I also create resources about different aspects of special education. And then I also have a Teachers Pay Teachers account where I have a lot of forms. I'm one of those people that if I need to do something like if there's a process or an activity that I need to do, I always create my own form for it because that's just how my brain organizes things.
Yeah.
So even like what I was talking about with like going over the student's IEP with them, going over their test results with them, explaining the results in a parent-friendly way at my meetings. I've made forms and resources for each one of those scenarios. So if you're interested in at all in any of those, you can find that in my profile too. But yeah, just in general, I feel like there's so much to learn from just connecting with your school team, or if you're not the biggest fan of your school team, there's plenty of other educators online that you can learn from.
Yeah. I know. I forgot what it was the other day, but you brought up something that was like, other people in other states were like, "What? Like, no, it's not like that in my state." I forgot what it was. It was like
Was
something
for draft IEPs.
draft IEPs. I remember
Yeah.
being so shocked that so many people were like, "No, that is not okay." I'm like, "Wait a
Oh
minute, that's like
man,
a norm."
I could write a book right now about it because since I started social media, like I think it's almost 3 years ago at this point, like 2.5 years ago. I've only ever worked in California, and I thought I had a good idea of, how things differ from state to state. But I thought like essentially, okay, if you're following IDEA, then it should be like pretty similar across all the states. But in the beginning, I've learned my lesson by now, but in the beginning, I used to post things thinking like, oh, it's that you can find it quoted in IDEA. Obviously, this is the right way. But then every state has like a little bit of a different interpretation of it. And so I would get sometimes angry, usually respectful on my Instagram, but um, yeah, sometimes like angry feedback being like, that's not how it works here. So I recently started my TikTok, and I'm mostly posting stuff that I've posted on Instagram already. And so it's a whole new wave of people that don't know who I am. And so I've started getting those like angry comments. And so that discussion happened on Instagram because I have a really positive, great community on Instagram, and we have great conversations, and I very rarely get anybody like angry at me on Instagram. So I brought the discussion back to Instagram because I'm like, am I wrong here? What the heck? So I thought it was a very like non-controversial post at all, because I do these things on my Instagram where it's called like a sample script, like, oh, here's an example of how I introduce the IEP draft at a meeting. Nothing controversial about that, I thought.
I
So I'm
thought,
like, thinking this was just a really nice post for other school teams, that this is how you can copy it if you want to introduce the IEP and explain what an IEP is to parents. And I got torn apart by the commenters on TikTok just saying like, a draft, you come to the meeting with a draft already written. That is predetermination. I can't believe you would do that. That's so illegal. And I was like, huh? And so I brought it to Instagram, and I was like, hey guys, like, let me know, like, what state are you in? And is it illegal to have a draft? Because this is like the first I've ever heard of that. And in some states, like very few actually, it is not, they're absolutely not allowed to have a draft. You you can have stuff in your mind as like, oh, if they qualify, I'll have maybe this goal, or, they could maybe benefit from this service, but you absolutely don't write anything down before.
mhm,
Some states have two meetings where there's an eligibility meeting first, and then there's an IEP meeting where you actually have the IEP. So obviously before the eligibility meeting, there's no draft because you haven't decided if they're eligible or not. And then
mhm.
the draft would happen before that second meeting. Well, in California, we do it all in one. And
Yeah,
so there is a draft, and we have, from in general, like everybody in California kind of had the same consensus that it's like, okay, yeah, we have a draft. It's absolutely like watermarked draft. Nothing is finalized. Some
mhm,
people have legal guidance to not have the services put in, or like, don't have this page written already. And then you go to the meeting, and then you determine if they're eligible, and then whatever. Yeah, so it was just really interesting. But yeah, some states you are absolutely required to send the parents a draft this many days before. So that was just one of those examples where I'm like, okay, the states are very different, and
yeah,
people are only looking at things from their perspective and their what they know. And
yeah.
sure, yeah, I don't know.
I know with my district specifically, I'm in Southern California, you're in Northern California, but
Mhm,
I think it's just we had so many legal issues that it
mhm,
was definitely frowned upon to provide a draft IEP. But if there was an advocate or a lawyer, then it was recommended. But it was really they were just asking for it. So you would basically go against what the district was recommending and give a draft beforehand, but you'd have to send it in beforehand to get reviewed to make sure that nothing was on there that would be considered predetermination before you like send it to lawyers or send it to advocates. So it's so interesting. Yeah, I've learned so much. Like I've worked closely with someone in Tennessee, and just hearing about how things have gone down in Tennessee, I'm like, wow, things are very different. And it all comes down to the interpretation of the same law. It's the same law across the nation, right? But it's
Hmm.
how states and how districts are interpreting how that's applied. So it's really
Yep,
fascinating.
I agree.
Well, thank you so much, Briana, for taking the time to share about all the work that you're doing. And I
Mhm.
just love that you're helping students actually understand themselves and their profiles, and then they can
Mm.
actually do something about it. They're not just stuck in this, woe is me, and this is being done to me, or I'm just being tested because I'm not smart, but actually giving them tools to learn about themselves and then apply what they've learned about themselves. And like you said, it not just benefits the student, it benefits every single person on the IEP team. And it also helps you become a better psychologist, right? It
Mm.
helps you develop the skills to be able to meet needs and be creative through the process. And like you said, even switch the language that you're using because a student's sitting right in front of you, of like taking a strengths-based approach because you're forced to, right? The student's right there. Um, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing about that.
Of course.
Thanks so much for joining me today. I would be so grateful if you could share this with anyone you can think of who works in education or happens to have a child with disabilities. If this was helpful for you, make sure to subscribe so you can hear some of the crazy and amazing stories of what is really going on behind the scenes in public education. Until next time, remember, in the famous words of Maya Angelou, each child belongs to all of us, and they bring us a tomorrow in direct relation to the responsibility we have shown to them.